So the political divisions became heightened as a result of Charles's personal rule. So the collapse in relationship between Charles and the political nation by 1629, as well as Charles's belief in his own divine right to rule, saw the king embark on a period of personal rule in 1629. So this basically refers to the 11-year period of which Charles is an absolutist now. He is running as a monarch without the support of Parliament. And this meant that he was unable to call upon Parliament for finances due to previous tension, and as a result of that he was in a difficult predicament in 1629 with which to raise funds on his own without the advice of Parliament to grant him subsidies. So just a reminder that subsidies were the grants that Parliament gave the Crown, which were legal taxes that they could impose on society, and each subsidy was worth approximately £70,000. So finances during the personal rule, so this is the 11 years that Charles governs on his own. Due to Charles's inability to gain subsidies from Parliament, the Crown had a debt of £2 million in 1629, and as a result of that, not only did Charles have to explore ideas of how to gain revenue with which to survive as the crown, but he also had to find a way of gaining money with which to reduce his debt. So how did Charles reduce debt, and what were his methods of fiscal feudalism? So fiscal feudalism refers to the crown's extravagant ability to gain money without parliamentary support. So Charles formed guaranteed peace with France through the Treaty of Susa in 1629, which would have been relatively easy given he was married to French royalty, and Spain through the Treaty of Madrid in 1630. Now this guarantees peace, which means that he isn't going to be flabbergasted by the costs of war. Bearing in mind as well that Charles has obviously been antagonising Spain in particular, but also France in the lead up to his personal rule. Charles withdrew military support from the 30 Years' War, which his father James had interfered in. This angered many Puritans and Protestants within England because they saw it as a crusade against Catholicism. So Charles's withdrawal from that in 1630 in what was a 30-year period war was proven to be very unpopular, and it also kind of signified a lot of propaganda that Charles was sympathetic towards the Catholic cause. He also introduced a new book of rates, so that was to do with tonnage and poundage, but it was also to do with kind of the tax associated with imports and exports. And from this, he raised £425,000 per year. Wardship was whereby the monarchy was permitted to control land that belonged to juveniles. So if a gentleman was going to inherit land from his father, which he couldn't have access to until the age of 21, the monarchy could own that property or that land until that son became of age, i.e. 21. So he would rent out this land, he would lease it, and from that he gained £75,000 per year. Monopolies, he managed to find a loophole in the Monopolies Act, and this was then becoming available through something called the Popish Soap. So there was a monopoly in soap, which there was a loophole in which Catholics could gain a monopoly in soap products, and therefore it became known as the Popish Soap, and this was granted £33,000 per year. Recussancy fines, so being a religious heretic, increased from nearly £5,500 a year in 1620 to, fast forward 14 years, he was then gaining nearly £27,000 per year from recussancy fines, so religious fines. So this kind of shows how it almost became a censored police state under Charles, with which you could be prosecuted for not following the Arminianism and Laudianism church, and that could result in fine, confiscation of land, and imprisonment. Distraint of knighthood basically refers to the gentry. So the gentry, as a recap, is obviously those who are middle class workers, if you like, that own land and property, which by they are not nobles, but they are kind of fairly well-to-do individuals. So with the distraint of knighthood, anyone holding land with an income of £40 per year or more who had not received a knighthood by Charles himself would be fined. And this was again trying to demonstrate his wealth and importance over those and through the nobility. And this granted him £175,000 by 1635. So that's not annually, that's by 1635. And ship money was probably the most successful way in which he was able to gain money. And this was reintroduced in 1634, and this accrued nearly £200,000 per year. So that's nearly worth 3 subsidies by Parliament. So obviously each subsidy is £70,000, so 3 subsidies would have been £210,000. So he was able to gain an awful lot of money via not calling Parliament. The ship money, though, was very controversial. It was a very successful way of Charles gaining power, but it was very controversial because ship money should have only been taxed at times of war. Obviously, though, Charles has ended conflicts or potential conflicts with Europe 4 years prior to this. So he's actually collecting ship money at times of peace, which is not the intention of the ship money tax. It was meant to be there for times of war. So he has been proven to be particularly unpopular amongst his people for not being able to speak freely about their religion and being fined for being the wrong religion. And in contrast to that, they're also being taxed upon ship money for times of peace when actually they're not at war. So that proves to be very, very unpopular, and this leads then on to opposition to Charles's personal rule. So England had been frustrated by Charles's reign for many years, but the nobility and gentry's refusal to pay the ship tax further alienated relations between Crown and Parliament, as demonstrated by the Hampden case in 1637. So Hampden is a politician. He's part of the nobility and the gentry, and he's quite closely affiliated with the likes of Pym. Hampden refuses point blank to pay the ship tax because he says that it's an illegal tax that shouldn't have been called because they're not at war, and he just refuses to pay it. And this results in a trial case going forward against Hampden by Charles with the Star Chamber, which is the criminal court case procedure, and this kind of further alienates Charles's relationship with the gentry and the nobility, and more will be discussed about Hampden shortly. Likewise, there was kind of an indirect opposition to Charles's reign through mass immigration, which demonstrated the discontent amongst Great Britain's population against Charles's personal rule. So we had a mixture of skilled workers, so the gentry immigrated, some of the nobility immigrated, even common folk were able to flee to certain countries abroad because they did not agree with Charles's personal rule. So Hampden and some associates were going to flee to America before the Short Parliament was called. And the loss of skilled workers obviously has then a very detrimental impact on the kind of economic structure of England at this time. The Short Parliament in 1640 became the turning point in English Parliament Crown relations, as Parliament had refused to subsidise the Crown taxes to deal with the Scottish threat, which we'll discuss later. Charles had dissolved them again before then arresting Pym and Hampden over their refusal to give him tax. And the escalation of the Scottish rebellion translated into something called the Bishop's War, and this was in reaction to the new Common Prayer Book that Charles tried to enforce after he was coronated. And Charles was unable to call an army quickly because he didn't have parliamentary support, so quickly had to accept the Scots call on the General Assembly in Glasgow, which was annulled because of, basically they annulled Charles's religious laws, his canon laws, and they also abolished something called episcopacy, which is where the church members are involved in government procedures. So Charles was forced to offer an agreement with the Truce of Berwick, but the Scots refused to disband their armed forces, and this forced Charles to call upon Wentworth. Wentworth becomes his new favourite advisor after Buckingham goes in 1628, and Wentworth had been in Ireland dealing with kind of Irish security and preventing rebellion in Ireland. Now, Ireland was divided into 3 subgroups. We have Catholics, so Irish Catholics, we have English Protestants, and we also have Scottish Presbyterians. So that then made it difficult for England to control Ireland because of these 3 competing kind of English, Scottish and Irish religious ideas. And the tension in Ireland was then exemplified by Wentworth's rule because he alienated these 3 groups as opposed to trying to bring them together with some consistency. So Ireland was exemplified by Wentworth's rule because he alienated all three subgroups rather than trying to bring them together. And his absence when recalled to England by Charles to deal with the Scottish threat then prompted a Catholic rebellion. The Catholics saw it as their opportunity. The Catholics saw it as an opportunity with which to rebel in the absence of any type of crown presence within Ireland, and from Wentworth being absent. And as a result of that, you have the Irish Rebellion in 1641, which lasted over a year and resulted in the massacre of 3,000 Protestants. So you can understand Protestants being angered by this, that not only has the monarch swayed towards Catholicism, but they see it also as the Catholics persecuting the Protestants. So by 1639, 1640, we found that not only has the monarch been collecting illegal taxes, but he's also alienated all three parts of Great Britain in the shape of England, Scotland and Ireland. But essentially it is Scotland that initiates and triggers this civil war, combined with Charles's personality.